Today on Stronger Than Reason, we take a gander at Joy Division's second and final studio album, Closer. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. Well, here we are on the cusp of a milestone episode. But you know what? 99 is a pretty special number too. And I find myself not wanting to squander this episode on a one-off, on something that is not so important to me, like, say, Mogwai's rock action, or maybe Einstürzen Neubauten Strategies Against Architecture 2, or even, I don't know, The Lords of Acid. No, I wanted this episode to mean something, so I've gone back to the well and decided to talk about an important album, one that is so important to me that it was the first actual album I bought on CD back in 1992. Every album I had bought prior to that was on cassette or vinyl. Now, it wasn't the first CD that I bought. That would have been the single for Crunch-O-Matic's Slaughterhouse, which I talked about in episode 80. And it wasn't the second CD I bought, which was Nine Inch Nails' Fixed EP, which I talked about in episode 31. But it was the first album I bought on CD, so it got a lot of play since it didn't have much competition for a while. See, back in the early 90s, I had become a netizen, and I discovered things like FTP sites and listservs, and connecting with other music fans around the world greatly boosted my interest in certain bands, namely New Order. So props to my peeps from the old Ceremony mailing list, but also New Order's progenitor, Joy Division. If you've listened to this show for any length of time, you probably know that I've been obsessed with these bands. And in particular, I'm really fascinated with the relationship between the two, how one developed musically into the other. I think it's interesting that it didn't all happen at once. Rather, it was more a gradual transition from punk to post-punk to new wave to synth pop, and the intermediate states are what interest me. It's kind of like when paleontologists find weird transitional species in the fossil record, the so-called missing links. And the history of Joy Division and New Order is riddled with these missing links. But first, let me recap a bit. What parts of Joy Division's history have we already discussed? And what is left? Well, I talked about Joy Division's origins in episode 46, which was all about their debut album, Unknown Pleasures, the record that largely launched the party boat that was Factory Records, along with the fortunes of her many friends, associates, as well as any number of industry tall tales and legends. I also talked about Joy Division's Odds and Ends compilation, Still, way back in episode 17. So yes, I'm very guilty of going out of order, but trust me, I intend to tell the whole story. That's what we're doing here, we're filling in the gaps. Another key piece was episode 54, which covered the birth of New Order, the band that rose from the ashes of Joy Division. Their first album, Movement, was largely considered to be a Joy Division pastiche, and they also recorded an album's worth of singles and released those early in their career. And of course, from there, I talked about all of the early New Order albums, with the exception of 1986's Brotherhood, which we will definitely get to in due time. So there are at least 6 hours of episodes of me detailing the history of Joy Division and New Order. But we jumped ahead there, didn't we? We're still missing 2 of the 4 important Joy Division albums. For one, I never talked about their singles compilation Substance, which was the companion to New Order's singles comp of the same name. And this is peculiar since Substance was the first Joy Division I ever heard. I had a cassette copy of it. And just as with New Order, Joy Division singles did not appear on their albums, yet were some of their greatest songs, to wit, legendary tracks like Atmosphere and Love Will Tear Us Apart. So it's a little strange that I haven't discussed Substance yet, but there it is. However, even more important than Substance was their second and final full-length studio album, the album that evolved their sound beyond the sparse, bleak coldness of Unknown Pleasures. It would actually come out posthumously 2 months after lead singer Ian Curtis departed from this earth and Joy Division had ceased to exist. This is the album during which dynamics in the band came to a head and after which things would never be the same. That's why this album is important to me. That's why I think it's worthy of episode 99. It's not just a timeless Joy Division album, but it is a classic album in general, one that did much to define 80s post-punk, and which had an inestimable influence on music of that era and beyond. Of course, I'm talking about the one and only Closer. And here it is, the first CD album I ever bought. The first thing to notice here is the striking cover, the lighter yang, perhaps, to Unknown Pleasure's dark yin. I don't know. I think it is interesting, though, when I line up my Joy Division albums, how monochromatic the covers are. They're all white, gray, and black, with the exception of a wee little bit of green on Substance here. You know, white, gray, and black, that's more or less how I feel about Joy Division. They aren't really known for their exuberance or their psychedelia. And, you know, this record, Closer, is maybe more somber than the other releases, given all that happened, you know. And you might think that cover artist Peter Saville had decided to cash in on Ian's tragic death by portraying a graveyard scene. But no, it was really just a coincidence. The cover design was completed while Ian was still alive, and the band and Peter Saville and label boss Tony Wilson simply never considered changing it. Just another example of Factory's bloody-mindedness, as they would call it, and as such, the cover art would become something of a memoriam for the band in general, and Ian in particular. Now, this is actually a photograph taken by Bernard Pierre Wolfe of an ultra-realistic tomb in an Italian cemetery. Saville complimented it with a typeface that's reminiscent of a gravestone etching. All very creepy, all suitable for spooky season, so, you know, cue the theremin. Woo! But again, I'm jumping ahead here. I want to step back even farther for a couple of minutes and talk about who Joy Division were and maybe provide some context for those who aren't as familiar with them. So, to me, the story of Joy Division is just as familiar as any well-loved legend told over and over again. I've seen it play out on the screen in films like Anton Corbin's Control and in Michael Winterbottom's 24-Hour Party People. I've read about it in books like Shadow Players, The Rise and Fall of Factory Records by James Nice, which is widely regarded as the preeminent written document of the Factory story, which, by the way, is going to get a paperback reissue here in January, so it'll soon be available again at an affordable price, so mark your calendars. But maybe most importantly, I read about it in first-hand accounts, like bassist Peter Hook's excellent memoir of his Joy Division days, Unknown Pleasures, Inside Joy Division, which is, of course, complete with blackened page sides. You gotta love it. Then, of course, we have drummer Stephen Morris's own Joy Division memoir, Record Play Pause, of which I have this electronic copy. It's a somewhat briefer and more lighthearted recollection, suiting Stephen's more laid-back personality. And again, we have guitarist Barney Sumner's take, chapter and verse, New Order, Joy Division, and Me, which is okay, I suppose, but I don't really love that it's ghostwritten. Write your own memoirs, people. So as you can see, the Joy Division story is well documented from a variety of perspectives, and it's sometimes hard to separate legend from fact, a situation that Tony Wilson nicely handled by advising thus, and I quote, "When forced to pick between truth and legend, print the legend." So work on Closer began in 1979, shortly after the release of their first album, Unknown Pleasures, which quickly grew into a juggernaut. It was a beacon for everyone looking for the next thing, whatever it was that came after punk. So the band were riding a high, and the state of the band was this. It was composed of Hooky, Steve, and Barney, along with their lyricist and lead vocalist Ian Curtis. Musically, all three surviving members remark on how well Joy Division functioned as a unit and how balanced it was. Each member had their clearly defined role. They simply did what they were each best at. Steve played the drums like a mechanical beast. Hooky redefined bass guitar by playing melodically high up on the neck, with a distinctive chorus effect provided by the Electro-Harmonix Clone Theory pedal. Barney provided guitar, and starting halfway through the Closer sessions, he introduced a new instrument, a synthesizer. In fact, it was a synthesizer he had built himself from a kit based on an article he read in a magazine. And this synth was a Powertran Transcendent 2000, a quirky little beast that suffered from Barney having just learned to solder. Its sound now closely associated with this album and Joy Division's later singles. Barney also acted as the arranger, organizing the band's jams into coherent songs. Now, Ian, being a reader, wrote all the words and, of course, sang them, but despite not playing an instrument, the others relied heavily on his advice for making songs as good as they could be. He was the arbiter of whether something was working or not, and crucially, was Joy Division's biggest cheerleader, encouraging his bandmates through his own enthusiasm. All of this sounds great. The band had largely taken off. They had been touring regularly around the UK and Europe and had started to break through. In fact, they had recently quit their day jobs and now found themselves working with factory partner, famed producer, and all-around weird guy, Martin Hannett, holed up in London's Britannia Row Studios, which was owned by no less than Pink Floyd. So ostensibly, things appeared to be going very well indeed. Unfortunately, there was trouble afoot. And before I get into that, I want to point out that these were still early days for this band. Joy Division was only in its fourth year of existence. They formed in June of '76, immediately following a show by the Sex Pistols at Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall. They released their debut album, Unknown Pleasures, just a few months prior to the Closer sessions, and they were all incredibly young, just 22 and 23, legally adults, but practically kids. Also, you have to picture Manchester in the late 70s. It was commonly depicted as a gloomy industrial hellscape, all concrete and factories, literal factories. No one's idea of an easy place to live. And the band members grew up working class. They were raised with the idea that they, too, could look forward to a future of working in those factories, just like their parents and grandparents had. There was really no reason for them to hope or dream that their future would be any different. And throughout it all, there was this idea that English men of the time just didn't talk that much. They didn't communicate wimpy things like feelings or let on that anything was remotely wrong, ever. Even when things were super wrong. And that behavior, that whole stiff upper lip attitude crops up again and again in the band's own memoirs in statements like, "We didn't know. We never talked. We just soldiered on. We never thought about his lyrics until it was too late." That kind of thing. So let's just say that there wasn't a lot in the way of empathy or sharing feelings. So what was going on that was so bad? What challenges did the band have? It really boiled down to Ian. And to understand him, you kind of have to try to separate the real Ian, or at least how he was perceived by the other band members, from his legend. And have you ever noticed that we idealize and revere pop icons who tragically die young? You know, it happens all the time with Kurt Cobain, John Lennon, Jimi Hendrix. We sanctify them. They become holy, larger than life. And in honoring their artistic memory, it's easy to forget that they were flawed human beings, as we all are, far from perfect. And the legend of Ian Curtis is very well portrayed in Anton Corbin's video for Joy Division's song Atmosphere, literally depicting Ian as larger than life, a tragic figure. The song becomes a moving testament to his heroic artistry, a soundtrack to the pathos and tragedy of a genius snatched away from the world all too soon. Never again would he be able to read Sartre and speak truths about the human condition while sipping absinthe and bitters with movers and shakers like William Burroughs, Cabaret Voltaire, and Genesis P. Orridge. But in real life, his bandmates attest that Ian was just one of the guys. He was their mate, and sure, he was book smart and curious about the wider world, but he was no slouch in enjoying fart jokes and getting hammered with the best of them. And after all, if he wasn't so much like them, just another working class stiff, he'd never have lasted in this band. So by 1979, Ian was a guy getting pulled in several different directions, and some of it was his own doing, some of it wasn't, and he didn't really have the tools to make things right. So what was going on? Okay, for one thing, he had health problems. He had epilepsy, and it was clear that too much excitement, and in particular too much crazy stage lighting, could trigger him. It had been getting worse and was getting in the way of the band's ability to perform. His doctor told him to take it easy, but his bandmates and their manager, the one and only Robert Leo Gretton, were laser-focused on Joy Division's growing success. No one connected the dots or talked about how that success was taking a toll on Ian's health. Even Ian was in denial. So gigs were increasingly ending with Ian having a seizure and getting dragged off stage. Fans might have figured it was just part of the show, except for the time Ian couldn't perform at all, so the band came out with another singer filling in, and before long, the angry audience started a riot. Anyway, Ian felt the weight of everyone's expectations, and that weight only increased as they experienced more and more success. The gigs kept coming, and before long, Rob would book their first tour of the United States. Ian had little confidence, though, that he would be able to keep it together that long. For another thing, he was living a double or maybe even a triple life. He got married very young, at just 19, but the itinerant rock and roll life had started driving a wedge between him and his wife, Debbie. The fact that they had just had a baby girl may have exacerbated the situation, as babies tend to do. Ian was really not prepared for fatherhood. He didn't have a plan. On one hand, he was a married father, a family man. On the other, he was the front man of this band that was gaining in popularity. While on the road in Belgium, he started an affair with a journalist, Annick Honoré. Word in the street was that it was never consummated, but it doesn't really matter. I don't think anyone involved disputes that it was an emotional affair. And it certainly happened while Ian was still married to Debbie and with a new baby. So at this point, I want to draw attention to Debbie Curtis's most excellent memoir, Touching from a Distance. And this is a first edition. I ordered this from a bookstore back when it came out in 1996. It was, of course, long before Amazon and long before this book was available in the U.S. as anything other than a rare import. I think it might have been the first print material I ever read about Joy Division or New Order. So getting this for me was just a big thrill. Debbie comes across as a very straight shooter. This is their story from her perspective, and I gotta say, there is very little of the Ian Curtis legend in these pages. I remember finishing this book and thinking, wow, Ian is a real bastard. Debbie has every right to feel that he did her dirty, because not only did he cheat on her, but he left her and their daughter in the most permanent, profound way. And this is not really a one-sided story, though. She also describes the times he was there for her, and it's clear that she really did love him despite his flaws and his hurtful behavior. And she captures, I think, what might have been the conflict going on inside his head. He might have been trying to figure out, who am I exactly? Father, husband, lover, party guy, intellectual, rock and roll icon. It seems to me that the real Ian never figured that out. He was never able to mature enough to be himself, his real self, with any degree of confidence. Things were just changing too quickly with his health, with his family life, and with this crazy band that threatened to take over his whole world. He just found himself over his head in a situation where a lot of people were pinning their hopes and dreams on him in mutually exclusive ways, and he found himself unable to sustain that responsibility. Now, all of this was building to a head as the band continued recording the songs that would become Closer. As I said, Barney, Hookie, and Steve were largely heads down, focused on writing and recording great music and savoring the perks of their increased popularity, like quitting their day jobs and getting to tour Europe on Factory's dime, although it was really their dime. And of course, Factory would famously fund a lot of extravagant projects out of the fortune that was amassed by Joy Division and New Order. I have no doubt that the band, such as it is today, is still around largely to try to recoup some of those financial losses. But anyway, the Closer sessions were a bittersweet time. In retrospect, everyone involved was encouraged by the band's growing success and the prospects for the future, while at the same time worried that Ian didn't seem to be rising to the occasion. He did not seem to be able to get ahead of his personal problems health-wise or relationship-wise. But rather than face those problems head-on or intervene on his behalf. Everyone just trusted that things would work out somehow. It's that northern stoicism again. Rob kept booking shows and the band kept recording songs with Martin. As usual, Martin was a perfectionist. He insisted on Steve recording each drum separately so that Martin could treat each with its own EQ and effects, and then he could arrange each perfectly in the stereo field according to his own preferences. The sessions just ground on and on. They recorded the guitar songs first, and at some point Barney brought in his synth. Now, Martin had introduced his own synth sounds to Unknown Pleasures, much to the band's chagrin at the time. They imagined themselves to be much more of a punk band, but Martin was thinking ahead. In retrospect, though, the band agreed that his production decisions gave Joy Division their own unique sound, and the presence of synths on Unknown Pleasures, in fact, elevated it from the other sound-alike punk of the day and put the band on a path to becoming their own thing. That whatever was coming after punk, post-punk. So I have to think that Martin was pleased when Barney brought his own synth into the studio. It just must have validated him and proved that he was right after all. And they proceeded to write songs around it. And on those songs, there was no guitar because logically, Barney couldn't play both at the same time. And that's one of the things I love about Joy Division songs. They didn't do a ton of crazy overdubs. And Martin, of course, got up to a lot of studio trickery, but the songs themselves were very simply arranged and always sounded like four people playing live. So if Barney was playing keyboard, there was no guitar. However, they would eventually find a way around this by teaching Ian how to play an open D major chord. And that's the only reason Love Will Tear Us Apart has both keyboard and guitar, because they convinced Ian to wail away on that D major during the choruses. Ian never really expressed a desire to play guitar and kind of did so half-heartedly because it was required. But the guitar that he bought was iconic. It was a Vox Phantom Special. It was this weird-looking thing with this pentagonal body and all these buttons on it to control onboard effects. These guitars are highly sought after now, more so because Ian was famous for playing one, especially in the video to Love Will Tear Us Apart. These guitars are now identified with him, and as a guitarist, I've often thought about picking one up, a replica Special 6. But I never made that happen. Even the replicas are pricey. They go for thousands of dollars. And by the way, Barney inherited Ian's, and he sold it at an auction in 2020 for nearly $250,000. And I don't know who owns it now, but it was exhibited in museums a few times since then. Anyway, the band ended up recording not just the 9 songs from Closer in Britannia Row, but 4 other tracks as well. I want to talk about all of them since they are all part of that missing link between Joy Division and the earliest New Order. But, first we'll go through Closer track by track. And we'll start off here with track 1, Atrocity Exhibition. Now, I gotta admit, I didn't love this song growing up, and thanks to the wonders of CD technology, I often fast-forwarded past it. Why? Because I thought it was just way too experimental to be a lead-off track. It doesn't serve the intended purposes of either acting as an ambient intro or showcasing what's to come. Of these 9 tracks, Atrocity Exhibition is the most out there. Steve's drumming, I think, is on point, and Ian's vocals are great, but something really seems off with the guitar. It's just a lot of atonal bends and just sheets of noise. And later on, I discovered that this was because Barney and Hooky decided to swap instruments. And I gotta say, Barney did a quite good Hooky impression. I think the bass here is melodic, varies up quite a bit. But man, there are very few musical ideas going on with the guitar. It's just irritating noise. And Hooky has stated that the guitar he envisioned sounded quite different before Martin got his hands on it. He claims Martin destroyed his tone with his Marshall Time Waster. So maybe something did get lost in translation there. I don't know. But, listening to this song now, I listened to it again all the way through just before recording this. And there is a nice arrangement here. It's not just all noise all the time. But, It just never really grew on me. I think it's one of my least favorite Joy Division songs, down there with, I don't know, like their really early punk stuff like Ice Age and Failures. About the only thing that it contributes as a lead-off track is the vocal line, "This is the way, step inside," which in my mind kind of conjures up an image of a carnival barker, outside the tent, luring people in to see something horrible, like the dog-faced boy or the man that turns into an ape. And by the way, Atrocity Exhibition took its name from a collection of stories by everyone's favorite transgressive author, J.G. Ballard, and I have not yet read that book, but maybe I should pick it up. So then let's go on to track 2, Isolation. Much like Love Will Tear Us Apart, this song features prominent keyboards instead of guitars. In fact, Isolation has no guitar at all. It's really a dance song, not a rock song. And as such, it would presage much of New Order's material. And for that reason, I find it fascinating. The drums are all live. They're not synthetic at all, although they kind of sound synthetic. From Hookie's account, Martin recorded Steven a number of times and then treated the sound and created this crazy bed of drum takes. But I especially like how the live drums kick in halfway through. It just sounds great and kicks the whole track up a whole other level. This is a really short song, under 3 minutes. It ends with a weird fake ending that, according to legend, was the result of a studio hand accidentally bungling an edit, when they used to actually cut magnetic tape with razor blades. And he ended up chewing up the end of the master tape. And every time he tried to fix it, he took more and more away from the tape. Engineer Mike Johnson stepped in and rescued the track, a feat which led to him later becoming New Order's preferred studio engineer up through and including Technique. But that's why Isolation ends as it does, with a weird echoing loop. Mike tried to make something interesting out of an otherwise abrupt ending. So on to track 3, Passover. This is a bit of a longer track. I was familiar with it from the live version on Still, which I talked about way back in episode 17. It's a very hypnotic sort of track that doesn't change a lot. So it's a good one to really appreciate Martin's production. You can really hear the space he put on the drums. They're not just sitting square in the middle of the mix. They're echoing a bit. They're panned all over. There's reverb on the snare it's a thing of wonder. And this is the famed Joy Division sound. It's very evident on Passover. As Hookie put it, Martin gave them the greatest gift any producer could give a band. He made the music timeless. And indeed, Passover sounds fresh even today, even though it was recorded 45 and a half years ago. Just an amazing accomplishment. As a song, though, I find it to be kind of a slow burn. Again, more hypnotic than dynamic, and pretty conventional in its use of guitar, bass, drums, and vocals. That said, I gotta call out Steven in particular for keeping such an absolutely perfect beat throughout. So then we move on to Colony. This is the first of several songs that highlights how innovative Joy Division were melodically, because they simply weren't trained musicians. The main riff here is just a repeated loop of root, fourth, and fifth. Super simple, and it is just the same the whole way through the song. There's not really a chorus here either. So it's a weird arrangement. Totally love the fuzz bass. That's something Martin would throw in from time to time, like on my favorite Joy Division song, Glass. Anyway, Colony is a cool song. It's a bit unusual. It's not pop, but it's still rock. And that brings us to the midpoint. Track 5, A Means to an End. This was my favorite of these tracks growing up, and I still love it today. Hookie calls it a fucked up disco song, which sounds about right. But this is the song that really highlights, for me, their lack of interest in following musical rules. Because the main riff just descends 4 halftones in a row. It's just not something a trained musician would ever think to do. It just isn't done. But it sounds awesome and it works. And that little fact pleased Tony Wilson to no end. He said something along the lines of that A Means to an End unlocked the fretboard for the band. It was their way of just saying they could play songs any way they wanted to. And their naivete in coming up with melodies made them unique. And I don't know, maybe that's true, but I can tell you that A Means to an End, also grooves. It's funky. It has a great feel. There's a lot of rhythm here. I love Barney's wordless chorus guitar parts. And I love how it ends with Martin just frequency shifting Steven's drums down. I just love this song. I think it's a great entree for anyone who wants to get into Joy Division or understand what they're all about. And speaking of, here's another track like that. Track 6, Heart and Soul. Talk about a missing link. This is essentially an early New Order song with words and lyrics by Ian Curtis. So you want to compare this to New Order songs like Cries and Whispers and Mesh. It just fits right in there. So what's happening on this song is that Hooky wrote the low bass, but he had Barney play it on the synth instead, which then freed him to freestyle with his patented high melodic bass. Meanwhile, Steven is playing his most slippery beat yet. And you want to compare this drum beat on Heart and Soul to the one he plays on New Order's Age of Consent. This one here is like that one's kid brother. The beat to Age of Consent is, in my mind, nearly unplayable and shows what a powerhouse Steven really was. I did talk about Age of Consent at length in episode 44 if you're interested. Heart and Soul also has some guitar. It only shows up between verses. So again, they're arranging things so Ian could play that part live if he wanted to. Anyway, Heart and Soul is synth rock. And, in addition to the synth bass, Martin added some pads and sound effects. And this song clearly shows the direction this band was headed and heralds 80s music in particular. And I have no doubt the use of synths here influenced countless bands later in the decade. So on to the next song, 24 Hours. This is the famous missing track from Still. They cut it from the live set on tape and CD due to space limitations. Back in the day, you could only find that live version on the vinyl version of Still. But to me, this is the most traditional Joy Division song on Closer. It could have fit on Unknown Pleasures. It's a very dynamic rock song, just guitar, bass, and drums. It's got loud parts, soft parts, and overall just a lot of power. Steven bashing the drums double time during the noisy bits. A very cool song, but in my mind, maybe not as forward-thinking as some of the others here. It does remind me a good bit of songs like New Dawn Fades and Dead Souls. And then we have two pretty interesting numbers to round out the album, the first of which is The Eternal. Now, this song always struck me as being extremely, almost comically goth. The funereal tempo, the big gated snare drum, the haunting minor key pads, the tasteful piano, the creepy locust-like atmospherics. This is Halloween music, folks, so be sure to blast it out on loop in your front door next week. Scare the hell out of your neighborhood kids. They'll sit on your lawn in despair as they listen to the Eternal and contemplate their own mortality and our pathetic human condition. Finally, we wrap things up with the closing song on Closer. And that's a good point. Did Ian intend it to be Closer, as in the closing album? Like the Mariano Rivera of Joy Division albums? Or did he mean it as Closer, as in close to you? I've only ever heard it pronounced as the latter, but I think it's interesting that there's a possible double meaning there. Anyway, the closing song is Decades. Another downbeat minor key number, though not nearly as goth as The Eternal. A very cool arrangement and a great vocal performance by Ian. But I gotta say, I am not really a fan of these synth voices here. I find them a little piercing, a little harsh, and maybe my impression of them was soured by the live version on Still, where the synth famously overheated and went out of tune as Barney was playing. So I really can't hear this song anymore, even on the album, without cringing a little. But the ending is cool, and it picks it up a lot. Again, I said it was a great arrangement, and it takes the album out on a suitably energetic note. In fact, Decades was the second to last song Joy Division ever performed live. Anyone care to guess the final one? Does anyone know? It's on Still. That entire final concert is on Still. But that last track they performed was Digital, the song that started it all way back on a factory sample. But that's the album. Just 9 songs, just under 45 minutes. But as I said earlier, it wasn't all the music they recorded at Britannia Row. They also recorded the 3 songs that would appear later on the Komakino Flexi-disc. Now, those songs were Komakino, Incubation, and As You Said. Komakino is a proper rock song. It's one of my favorite Joy Division songs, in fact, because it's got interesting guitar, bass, and drum parts. I think it's a great example of how they just didn't play their instruments in a stock kind of way, to paraphrase Lars Ulrich. It's much like a means to an end in that regard, just parts that trained musicians probably wouldn't have come up with. It's got a lot of arpeggiated guitar, a lot of wild hooky bass, and Steven banging on the toms like a madman. So what's not to like? It's a good energetic song. If I recall, the name was derived from one of the venues they used to play in Germany that was called Kant Kino. Incubation is a really interesting thing. It's an instrumental that sounds to my ear like Joy Division playing surf music. It's got a really insistent beat. It's a totally great song to drive to, and it's got a lot of little melodic things going on to maintain interest without any vocals. And in fact, Incubation is probably the most complete Joy Division song that doesn't have vocals across their entire catalog. And why Ian didn't write words for this, I'll never know, because it is a super cool song. Again, one of my favorites. It would be an outstanding theme song to something, and I'm surprised that hasn't happened yet. Then we have As You Said, which is a little bit of nothing. It's not really a song even. It's just 2.5 minutes of a beatbox with some weird synth sounds over it. By all accounts, this was just Martin faffing about in the studio. It wasn't premeditated or anything. They included it on the Flexi-disc as a curiosity in much the same manner as New Order would include Perfect Pit on the end of the single for The Perfect Kiss. Just a weird, unnecessary thing like putting a tennis ball on your trailer hitch. Finally, the band also re-recorded Love Will Tear Us Apart in Britannia Row. They famously recorded it a bunch of times. Martin viewed it as their masterpiece, something truly special, so he spent countless hours mixing it in various ways and re-recording parts over and over. And that's why there are so many versions of it scattered across so many releases, because he was never happy with it. Love Will Tear Us Apart, of course, remains Joy Division's most popular song. I will give it its due later, though, if and when I talk about their singles comp, Substance. And that is truly it, folks. All 13 songs from the Closer recording sessions, the last studio recordings Joy Division would ever make, if you don't count the practice session recordings that yielded Ceremony and In a Lonely Place, which I don't, but you do you. Well, what happened next? I suppose you know the story. Rob Gretton booked Joy Division for a short tour of the United States. Everyone appeared to be looking forward to it, even Ian, who was a big fan of American music. They were all eager to experience New York. Who wouldn't be growing up in Manchester? New York was so exotic to them it might have been Buenos Aires. Hooky dropped Ian off at home Friday night, May 16th, 1980. Debbie and Ian had an argument that resulted in Debbie moving in with her parents, so they were apart temporarily. Ian was not mentally or emotionally well. He had already experimented with self-harm in various ways in preceding months, and for whatever reason, the events of that weekend culminated in him taking his own life. Debbie, his wife, the mother of his baby daughter, found him on Sunday. All this is depicted in the film Control and in 24-Hour Party People, and of course in the first-hand books that I showed you earlier. I don't need to rehash the details. Let's just say the band were shocked. They were supposed to leave for the United States on Monday, hence Blue Monday. And did they ever talk about it? Hash out what went wrong, what they could have done to stop this from happening? No, not really, because in their stoic northern way, they simply drank a lot of beer and agreed to meet in the practice space on Monday. They kept on keeping on, to paraphrase the N.F. Porter song. They kept writing music. Hooky showed up with the opening riff to Dreams Never End. They all took turns singing. They didn't really have a plan. They never really considered replacing Ian with someone else from the outside. They tacitly agreed, again, never stating it outright, that Ian just couldn't be replaced. Someone would have to get promoted to singer or demoted, however you saw it, and that ended up being Barney, for better or worse. But that left a logistical difficulty since he couldn't sing and play guitar at the same time. So their solution was to backfill him with another close friend, Steve's girlfriend, in fact, Jillian Gilbert. Jillian had already filled in on guitar at an earlier gig when Barney had cut his hand open fooling around with a broken bottle. So to them, it made a kind of sense. Joy Division had already agreed early on that if any should leave the band would be over. So, indeed, they changed their name to New Order, and for years refused to acknowledge the past. They didn't play Joy Division songs or even give interviews because they knew that would force them to confront what had happened, and they were unwilling to do that. It really wasn't until New Order's first split in the 1990s and reformation at the end of that decade that they started to embrace Joy Division and began playing the songs again with any regularity. So a gap of nearly 20 years. I guess it took that long for Manchester's form of avoidance therapy to do its trick. So why do I love Closer? Again, this is the culmination of Joy Division's sound just before their dissolution. It shows how far they came as songwriters and musicians in just a few years, and more importantly, it charts a clear course for the band. Unfortunately, before they got there, Ian hit the eject button and bailed out, but the rest of the band would seize the controls and keep the dream in the air, to mangle a metaphor hopelessly. I see Closer as the counterpart to Movement. I see the two releases fitting together like a plug into a socket. As I said in the Movement episode, Movement really is the third Joy Division album. It's what it would have sounded like. I mean, it only makes sense. It's the music that was inside Barney, Hooky, and Steve at that time. I firmly believe it would have come out with or without Ian. The lyrics, of course, would have been different. We'll never know what Ian would have done specifically with those songs, how he'd have put his own spin on them, but in my mind, there isn't a huge gap between Joy Division and New Order. The songs shift seamlessly from one to the other. And there you have it, folks. Joy Division's studio swan song, Closer. Though, of course, Factory and London Records would thoroughly pillage the Joy Division back catalog for decades to come. Just as with New Order, there are plenty of pointless box sets and comps out there, and new ones coming out all the time. Keep in mind, though, that Joy Division really only recorded 70 or so songs, not counting duplicate recordings, live versions, and early demos. Their body of work is small, but tremendously influential and powerful even today, more than 45 years later. Give Closer a spin if you haven't lately, and I think you'll agree it holds up. It doesn't sound dated, but in fact sounds timeless. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason, either on YouTube or on the podcast platform of your choice. The show that knows how to apply the C principle, search for hazards, evaluate them to determine a plan of action, and then execute the plan to maintain safety. We're also applying ATGAT, Find C, and T clocks on a regular basis, as should you. Highly recommended to all. As always, thanks for listening, and we look forward to maybe doing something special for our next episode, which is, after all, number 100. We'll see, though. We'll see. Stay tuned, and until next time, stay strong.